episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. We're bringing you another fascinating guest today who's helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. As a little background to today's show, the Sodexo company is a French food services and facilities management organization. It's headquartered outside of Paris, and it currently employs over 400,000 employees across 80 different countries, and they serve many different sectors, including private corporations, government agencies, schools anywhere from preschool to university, as well as hospitals, clinics, assisted living facilities, military bases. And every day they are responsible for serving an amazing 100 million consumers meals. And today we have the honor of being joined by John Wright, who is Senior Vice President and Global Head of Food at Sodexo, and has served in various roles of increasing responsibility over the past 25 years, including management of both Sodexo's signature brands and the national brand portfolio, consumer insights, to offering development and management of various internal design teams, culinary, retail food management system teams. A lot of very interesting things to talk about today. And with that introduction, John Wright, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today and talk with us.
No worries. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's great to have you here. John, I'd love to start things off like we typically do by handing our guest the floor just for a little bit. If you could just talk a little bit for a few minutes about yourself, a little bit about where you grew up, how you ultimately got interested in the hospitality industry. I saw you worked at Marriott a few decades ago, and a little bit of the early career journey. I think that'd be a great way to start things off.
Yeah, sure. I've always had an interest and passion around food. I think that's something that goes back to me from an early age. I actually spent a lot of my early life, I was brought up actually in the Middle East. So I was actually, as a child, I was in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So that's kind of where I started. And, I kind of, had an opportunity then to experience many different types of cuisine, particularly in the Emirates. It was very big on kind of Lebanese and some of those interesting influences and flavors. So I grew a passion for food, and it's something that I was really interested in. So I actually started my career at Heathrow, for the want of a better word, and I was in retail in Heathrow. So I've actually worked in all of the terminals with the exception of Terminal 5 because that wasn't open when I was there. But yes, I had a real opportunity to work in that environment, which was very, very fast-paced, high volumes, very, very unpredictable. Our whole life revolved around the weather and an aircraft, so it was very, very different and very, very challenging. And then I decided that I wanted to do something a little bit different, and decided that I'd like to come into food service. And strangely enough, the choice that I made, and I was very lucky when I applied to be accepted by all of the major players, and predominantly within what would be the business and industry sector, which was probably more aligned to what I was doing in retail. But I actually chose not to go into business and industry, and initially started in what was then called the education and healthcare sector. So I actually went in the UK, into independent schools, state schools, some universities, and also healthcare. So, and the reason I did that, I thought it would be quite interesting to apply my retail experience in knowledge into a very, very different, I suppose, a really different type of business. You could say within the university business, the retail was quite similar to the airport environment from a retail perspective, but a fair amount of the business was what we would call consumption, so the provision of meals to be it patients or visitors or independent schools, etc. So I did that for a number of years, and I was responsible for some of the leading independent schools in the UK, and then finally made the transition into corporate services within the UK, where I was ended up being a divisional director, and I ran kind of part of London and the whole east of the UK. And so that was kind of more akin to where I came from. Because I ran the region with the retail principles that where I came from, I was seen as changing up the model. So after a fair amount of persuasion, I was convinced by the UK managing director to move out of operations and then move into a marketing role. And I was head of marketing for business industry corporate services within the UK. And so that's how I ended up going from a very strong operational role into a functional marketing role. And that worked really, really well for me. And then I was approached by the group to go and work in the group function within marketing. So then whilst I continued to live in the UK, I went across and worked for group. So headquartered effectively out of Paris, but with a global reach. And that was really, really exciting. Huge amount of travel, very, very diverse, which was great, which was really, really interesting. It also was interesting in that I'd historically worked in what I would call very mature markets like the UK and like France. But having a global role, had responsibility for very, very mature markets, like the US, like the UK, like France, but also where we were seeing huge growth. So South America and Asia, which was very, very interesting in terms of, in some part of the world, you're looking at driving the top line revenue in terms of how do you grow the overall business. And then in some of the other parts of the world, more top line than we could have hoped for. But then how do you transition that into profitability in terms of how do you manage that? So that was kind of my role in a global marketing function. Then I came across to the US. In 2012 with a brief to build the bridge and coordination between the main segments here in the USA, which worked really, really well. And then we went into what we call, we transformed the business, and we moved a lot more away from individual countries into much more global segments. And then they created what is now what we call within Sodexo service operations. So kind of I would say the technical arm in terms of building our tools and our processes and ways of working on behalf of the business. And they asked me to head up the global food platform, which is what I do today. So that's kind of the transition in terms of where I started within retail, how I ended up into food service, and then how I moved from an operational role into marketing, and now heading up the global food platform. And I think, one of the reasons why, for me, I think it works is my background is operational. So I really understand, hopefully, that in terms of some of the challenges that we face at an operational level. So I can understand how we need to be practical in the solutions that we build. But then obviously having done marketing for a significant number of years, understanding how that needs to be wrapped and packaged and communicated into the business. So I think in terms of having that broad skill set, equips me quite well to do the role that I currently do in terms of leading our overall global food platform in terms of the way that we work.
Got it. Got it. And continuing along that, I mentioned some of sort of the stats in the intro in terms of 100 million consumers, 80 countries, some other interesting things that I came across. Obviously the company was it goes back to the 1960s. You're on the Fortune Global 500 list. You're the second largest employer amongst the French multinationals, and it's interesting because Sodexo, obviously we know the name, but we don't hear as much about it per se as this one more consumer-facing brand. But obviously, when you have a much, as you were just saying, a much broader purview in the sense that not only do you have to understand the difference between what someone in a school may want versus the cafeteria at a government agency, but obviously my child's high school here in Center City, Philadelphia, they might have a different interest than a child in Abu Dhabi or a child in the UK and so forth. Quite a diverse portfolio that you have to oversee. Talk a little bit more about this, if you would, and tell us some interesting sort of fun facts, if you would, about the food service business as you've sort of evolved through this over the last few decades.
Yeah, sure. I think you're absolutely right, is that we're almost an organization that sits behind a lot of organizations, and we're not necessarily front facing, and I think that brings some unique challenges and brings us some unique opportunities. I think that what I would say is that that the breadth and depth that Sodexo has as an organization, I think brings a huge amount of responsibility as well, because if you think about it, is that potentially we could literally see somebody from when they first start to eat their meals.
Yep.
So in an elementary school, and then they could be with us all the way through their working careers. If unfortunately they have to go into hospital, we could be serving them in the hospital, and then we could be serving them in a retirement home, and so literally absolutely from end to end. And it's a huge responsibility and a challenge. And I think that certainly some of what makes the job really, really interesting is just the sheer diversity.
Sure.
You can be, and you talked about some of the places that we provide food service to, and we do have, if you take, for example, is predominantly in the Parisian market, we have some really front facing to the consumers. So, whether it be the Eiffel Tower, which is actually
sure.
a restaurant, you could have something like, you could be on the Bateau Parisien on the Seine in Paris. Again, that's a Sodexo experience. Even to the point of Le Nôtre in terms of retail stores. And we also have a culinary school, which is run by Le Nôtre as well. So in terms of the breadth, whether it's whether it's the Dakar Car Rally, which is all about logistics, and again, that's a Sodexo facility, or a very, very large remote mine that could be in South America or in Australia, then that's really is as much about logistics and as much about in terms of making sure that we can get the product to the consumer from a logistics perspective. But what I think is very, very, to me, which makes Sodexo a very, very unique company, is your fact that we were established in the early 60s by Bellon. We only have our second chairman, which is Sophie Bellon, which is quite interesting. And the company, as large as we are, remains family controlled. And I think that's something that I would say should not really be underestimated. I think it's fair to say that means, very much Sodexo as an organization is focused on the long term in terms of the role that we play, as well as certainly the values of the family goes through the organization. And I think that's that's unique, and it brings a very strong culture into Sodexo. So I think it's what makes us very, very different, I think. And to take your point, is it's really interesting that we're so diverse in terms of the way we as a company play in the market, I suppose. And I think whether it's providing the food at Ascot for Ascot Week, which is huge volumes, or whether it's provision of the catering for a university here in the US, it's very, very different. And I think that the point that I would make is Sodexo as an organization, as you said right at the beginning, is we're broad in terms of the services that we provided, not only just in food services, but with the other services we provide, as well as our vouchers business, as well as our in-home services business, that helps us in terms of, particularly through the very difficult times that we've had through COVID, to be able to weather the storm well, which I think for some organizations has been very difficult. So I think that helps, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I did see the part about being a family-owned organization. I always find those little facts about interesting companies quite unique in today's world. But that's awesome.
I think, to take your point, is for companies of our size, it's absolutely phenomenal that that's been a really core value of the company to remain. Obviously we're listed on the stock market, but in terms of being able to protect the independent company is a very, very interesting challenge, I suppose, and something that is very passionate, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
From a company's perspective.
Absolutely. John, I read a piece that you wrote, I think was it last year, and it was about a really interesting fact that currently 75% of the world's food supply is represented by only 12 plants and 5 animal species. And you recently announced a partnership between Sodexo and 2 other groups, one with the NOR organization and one, I think, the World Wildlife Foundation, talking about the development of what you termed future 50 foods. I can think about, just sitting back in my own time that I've been hanging out on this planet, and I've seen, the quinoa come along and farro, and I think that, the kiwi wasn't very popular back in the 70s, but now it's everywhere. Talk a little bit about sort of the plans for some of these future foods, because I think it's rather fascinating that, not only obviously you have to deal with the 100 million meals and all the stuff that we currently focus on, but in this world that, where we're constantly thinking about sustainability, conservation, and so forth, a lot of plant species, a lot of animal species out there that we don't normally think of as foods in our daily diet. But talk a little bit about what you're planning here.
Yeah, sure. I think, we've been on a journey, and I think in terms of for us as an organization, and going back to the point in terms of when you're as big as we are, then we have a responsibility to the planet, and also a real responsibility to our consumers. And that in terms of the reduction in our overall carbon footprint is really of focus to us. And the key thing is to look around to understand, some of the alternative grains and pulses that are available to us, that says, that are more sustainable to grow, require less water, etc. And I think your point is really valid, is to understand, what's the next quinoa, what's the next thing that's going to come across. So we worked very closely with North Foods, obviously Unilever, and a number of key partners to understand in terms of how we could look at promoting and making available to some of our consumers some alternatives to what they would normally purchase, or that really could be introduced into the diet. So understanding, to take your point, is how can we look at being less reliant on some groups and broaden out in terms of the products that we could make available to our consumers. And so that's kind of like the overall reason to it. The other thing that I would say is that, you know, that's something that we've recognized, and which is really, really important, is the quality and taste of the recipes in which the ingredients are used, and making them a real alternative to the consumer. And I think that's the one point that I would make, is that, you know, I think if you think about it in like health and well-being has been a very good example.
Sure.
Is in the early days, it was almost puritanical in terms of the product. And you're like, you're really, you know, the amount of sacrifice that you want me to make for what I perceive as a relatively low return, I'm not quite sure. So I think in terms of, that was one of the things that focused us. So that's why in this particular case, we brought a number of our chefs from different countries around the world, put them in one place together, gave them the ingredients and said, right, okay, now go play, develop recipes and do things that you believe in, turn out dishes and that you would be proud to serve, that you believe the customers would see as a real alternative. So I think the team developed in the early stages about 40 something new recipes. We, because of our size, we've been able to make it available now. I think we're in 15 countries. So we've worked very closely with our supply chain to make sure that the product's available. And I think in terms of availability, the product range now is available in about 6,500 sites. So it's kind of, and you know, our hope is that consumers will take the opportunity to try them, that will like some of them, and these are ingredients and products that they can find that are readily available on the high street, but just used in a very, very different way. So I think that's kind of, you know, our overall approach. And it, you know, it's part and parcel of our overall commitment to increase the amount of plant-based in our overall menu as a whole. And I think that, you know, to me, it's something that is going to continue in terms of as a trend. And, you know, even to the point, I think it's almost going to go, you know, to a way of people choose in terms of being balanced in their overall menu. So I think, you know, I think certainly from our perspective, you know, it's good that we partner with external groups. You may have seen also we created something that we call the Future Food Collective. And that's where we bring in Food for Climate League, Sodexo, some of our vendor partners, and use resource within some of our vendor partners that we wouldn't necessarily have access to, and then kind of bringing these individuals together in a way to really challenge us to think about what should we be really considering, how should we really be thinking about the future, and making recommendations on where we as an organization needs to go. And it's great to, you know, have that external influence, be able to say, you know, take the blinkers off and look at this in a very, very different way than perhaps you have in the past.
Absolutely. And it got me thinking of some, I have a couple of friends that live down in Brazil, and they always talk about how, a couple of hundred fruits they have down. I can't even name 30 fruits. I don't know what you're talking about, but it's nice to see that, especially with your, your international model there, that you're able to source and sort of make the right contacts with the thought leaders to explore some of these things I'd never heard of. I'm not ashamed to that I haven't heard of some of these plants, but
I think you're absolutely right, and I think sometimes I think the one point that I would make, and I think something you have to recognize, is some of these products are really, really good, but they're not necessarily easy. In the way that you have to manage them, and easy in the way you need to cook with them. So I think in terms of, there's a bit of development on our side with our chefs in terms of the, how to work with the product and how to treat the product. But then, in the same way, we make a lot of those, recipes and ways of working available to our consumers, so they have the ability to be able to learn from some of the things that we've done and perhaps some of the mistakes that we've making. But I think in terms of, like all of this stuff, it's kind of opening your eyes to it in terms of making it available. And I think in terms of, I go back to the point that I would raise in terms of the environment that we serve within, it really takes away that risk and those barriers, because we can produce it, we can make it available, so you're not having to go out and buy a lot of product and then go, well, am I really going to like this? You can taste it, and then you can be educated to it, and you can make your own decision. Is this something that I want to do at home? So I think that it's something certainly that I think it's going to be interesting in terms of the fact around climate change and what that's going to mean, and how crops are going to be grown into the future, and the whole challenges that some parts of the world will have because of changing environment, is to understand in terms of, potentially could there be other crops available that they could, with a changing environment, that they could grow that will help them sustain themselves within individual countries. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge for us for sure.
Absolutely. An interesting challenge nonetheless.
Well, I think the point that I would make is, because of our size, because of our approach, is that, and certainly if I take something like the US market, is that, once Sodexo starts to lean into a product and starts to put it into our menu cycles, that starts to bring distribution, that starts to bring product availability. So it kind of is in some cases, we can be a facilitator in helping get some of these products more broadly distributed, just because of our sheer size.
John, when I go into my kid's school, and it's actually where I went to school, it's like night and day. I'll go into the cafeteria, occasionally have lunch with them, and there's sushi, and there are, as you were saying, a wide range of plant-based alternatives, Brussels sprouts, which was always like the bane of my existence. That look really good, and the way we cook them and how we flavor them and all this stuff. Nonetheless, there's always parents hanging around. They're like, we need more health and nutrition and behind the food. You at Sodexo have a fascinating health and wellness initiative called Mindful by Sodexo. It seems like it's not just about the nutrition component. You have something called Mindful Tools, involves wearables, and there's apps. Talk a little bit about it. It's really a very complex but very interesting health and wellness program.
Yeah, so basically, we did a bit of research around all of our different wellness programs around the world, and we kind of figured out what worked and what didn't work. And the one thing that was very, very clear to us, that the minute that our consumers perceived that we were lecturing, is all of a sudden they became switched off to the idea of thinking about health and wellness. And it was kind of like, we don't want to be dictated to. So we decided back then that we worked with our dietitians in a number of countries, and we laid out what would be our criteria in terms of, reduction of sodium, etc. And we would have some criteria around what something could be if it was mindful. And then we said, what we want to do is to develop a range of menus and recipes that would meet our mindful criteria, that would be really exciting to the customer and not perceive huge consumer sacrifice.
Okay.
So we ran competitions like, tell us what dishes you'd like to make healthy. So I'll give you a really good example. Something like, we got one of the big requests in was for flatbread. How could we do flatbread, and how could we make it much more healthier? How could we do a healthy hamburger? And even in the early days, we were doing a mushroom beef blend that enabled us to give a decent, and also as well as reasonable portions, because there's no point saying, oh, we can give you something really, really healthy, and it's kind of like 1.5 ounces, 2 ounces of something. No, it has to be. So that's kind of the premise that we came from. And then the next thing that we said was, well, if you want to do a little bit of exercise, what are the things that you can do that will make a difference, but are not seen like this is a huge journey that you want me to embark on? So with little tips like, mark out what we call the mindful mile. So what a circuit would look like close to your workspace around walking a mile. Made recommendations like just park at the end of the car park, not the car parking spaces the nearest to the door, and just gave lots of tips and ideas around things that you could do that all just contributed to an improvement in your overall wellness. We also talked about things like, in terms of you as an individual taking time, your mental wellness. So to really a broad program in terms of, in all of its facets around wellness. So it didn't just narrowly focus just on food, but it also focused on the other stuff. And as I say, and making, particularly as it related to food, making menu items that were every day, but that we substituted product, we changed the cooking method, and we did things, all of them materially impacting on the health properties of the individual menu, and it's worked phenomenally well for us. If I look at the menu mix, so whereby what's our rate of sale within an account, is we were able to double the amount of healthy options that were being consumed by our customers, and we've done some gamification. So all of the kind of the tips and ideas that you could possibly use, and try to make it fun, and really just taking a very participative approach to wellness, making it broader, and just making it more acceptable to the consumer, with a very clear view is that we want to significantly increase participation. And people, and it's quite interesting is, even making all of the recipes and everything available for the consumers to do at home. It's amazing that how many, and how much feedback that we get. And there's also this ability to ask dietitians questions and stuff like that. So we try and make it something that is in terms of not prohibitive and seen as a huge sacrifice in terms of making healthy choices. And I think it goes kind of like along the lines that you were talking about earlier, is in terms of, that whole thing around flexitarian, and seeing a lot more people that are actually choosing plant-based as a part and parcel of their overall menu, and in terms of their choices within the week. And so I think it's quite interesting, this approach that I think people are now taking is it doesn't have to be all one thing. It can be, you know what, I can just have a broad menu and I make choices that are right for me. And, you know, I think our role is to make the products available, make them tasty and make the information available to consumers so that they can make the choices that they want to make in terms of the overall menu. But, you know, I think in terms of, I think what's going to be interesting for me is, and I think we see it in a number of other things, but particularly as we start to think about plant forward, is that I think it's not necessarily understood broadly by our customers. And I think that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to be really focused on in the coming months and years, because I think that consumers, it's quite interesting, is consumers don't necessarily understand what we mean by plant forward. And I'll just give you some interesting that we did a survey across UK, US, France, China, Brazil, and we asked consumers some questions around the whole topic of plant-based, and it was quite interesting. 42% thought, well, it's just not dairy and eggs. And, you know, okay. 28% said, well, you can have some dairy and eggs. And 29% said, well, you can still have meat, but it's just reduced. You're like, okay. And I think the other thing as well is that, you know, the view as well, that particularly on some of the protein alternatives, the perception was, and it's really healthy. And it's quite an interesting, because if you actually looked at some of the protein alternatives, perhaps not what the consumer would perceive. And I think also as well as when you start to ask consumers, what's your motivation to go down a route of potentially what would be a plant-based diet, is the two overriding drivers was health and the environment. Health was at 61% and the environment was at 53%. So I think in terms of the consumers are beginning to really start to understand there is, you know, the environment, what they choose to eat, there's a direct correlation between the two. And I think that's going to be something that is continue to put pressure on this particular category, I suppose, for the want of a better word. But it was interesting for me is when you asked them about taste, it was something like about 25% of the consumers had any thoughts around taste, but the vast majority was around the environment and healthy choices, which I think is quite interesting. And I think the other thing for us from an organizational perspective is that it's quite interesting that something like I think about 54% of the consumers said they eat 3 meals a day plus numerous snacks. And we had about 7% of the consumers said they have five smaller meals, not three main meals. And then it's something like 25% of the consumers said 3 meals a day, no snacks, very, very regimented. So it's quite an interesting in terms of you've got some people that are not snacking, some people that are snacking, and then you've got a group relatively small at 7% are on the kind of like, I'd rather have 5 small meals spread out through the day rather than 3 major meals. So I think in terms of all of those things go into, certainly for us, go back to the start of this conversation, is makes it very, very interesting is evolution of the way people want to eat. Versus their thoughts about wellness versus their thoughts about the environment.
Very interesting. And I'm in group one, by the way. I snack an exceptional amount, probably much more than I should. But yeah, I'm definitely in that snacking category. Um, so, John, so okay, we talk about, okay, so people want healthy foods. They want foods that are good for the environment. They want novel varieties of food, fun. We mentioned that as well. But the one thing an organization like yours has to constantly be thinking about is that the food has to be there. When you're serving 100 million people a day or 100 million meals, obviously pandemics and supply disruptions and so forth get in the way. And, you know, I would assume, you know, if all of a sudden, you know, the onions don't show up on the tanker ship at some point at some port, you can't just substitute garlic or whatever the may be. Talk a little bit about future proofing and how an organization like Sodexo with the 100 million meals deals with some of these big issues, especially that we've seen in the last couple of years.
I think I'll turn your question a little bit on its head, a little bit.
Please.
Is I would say that within the food service industry, historically in the past, it was very much along the lines of what you've just said, is that at individual site level, that whether it's the chef or whether it's the chef manager would place the orders. And then, as you say, you always then, and it's been around for a long time, you know, what was not available, what had been substituted, what had been changed, what didn't turn up that day, etc. And there was a huge opportunity for our individual site managers to get as creative as they needed to be to ensure that there was product available to the customer. So we got lunch out, or we got breakfast out, or we got dinner out. And, you know, to some degree, that's kind of where food service came from. But what the challenge that we face today is that our consumers are very, very demanding. And in some cases, from a legislation perspective, we've got to be making available calorific content of the new items. We've got to be talking about what allergens.
Sure.
All of those things that historically we didn't necessarily have to put in front of the consumer. So those are all things that today that we have to make available to the consumers. The other thing that I would say that has really, really escalated this is through COVID, you've seen a lot more facilities move to click and collect, digital, ability to pre-order, etc. So if you think about it, is you've got a huge requirement to put into the hands of our consumers accurate nutritional information, as well as allergens, as well as making those products available to the consumers through digital applications. And also that means if you start talking digital, you know, and you as a consumer, I'm sure the same as me, is when you go onto, you know, a restaurant website and you see pretty awful pictures, you kind of, okay, let's move on. I'm not buying from there. Or your grocery store, when you can't see the product that you want to buy, you don't buy it because there's no picture and there's just a grayed out box. So on top of that, we've got the whole food photography menu piece. So all of that puts a huge pressure on any provider in our place to be much more disciplined around what we're putting into our units. So not to try and get too boring, but, you know, we have to be able to manage that.
Yep.
You know, for the first time ever, we have a very, very clear, what we would call end-to-end food management process. We're using a lot more technology now than we've ever used in the past. We have the ability to make real-time changes in the menus at site level, if particularly we have an issue around product lack of availability or some challenges. And obviously our supply chain does a really, really good job in terms of clear understanding for us within the food platform, what product's going to be available to us when we think we might have a particular challenge in a country or a market around availability of product. So what I would say to you is how we're managing it is we have, and it's very boring, but we have a very, very strong process that we manage. Each of the segments within each of the countries has very segment specific menu cycles and multiple menu cycles that are really focused on delivering their consumer experience, which is all managed by the food platform. We're able to aggregate that up so we can have conversations with our supply team in terms of saying, okay, right, this is what product we need available. This is how it's going to look. And those are the conversations then that we will have with them, that they'll say, well, you know what, you're going to have a real problem on these particular commodity groups. Okay, fine. Then what commodities can we get access to? What will we have? And then we will, we will go in and proactively manage the overall menu to make sure that we can account for the things that you've just talked about. But that still doesn't mean we'll get a curveball thrown at us, kind of like this week that X is not going to be available. And then, our job then is to, right, okay, fine. Where is that product appearing next week? Mm-hmm. Where is it within the menu? What can we get access to? What changes do we need to make? We can make them in the system, and then to the point that I was trying to raise to you, that automatically recalculates all of the nutritional, makes the changes that we need to make on allergens, and enables us to push it from a technology perspective directly to the consumer. So our digital applications to consumers are directly linked to our food management system, site-specific. So if a site-specific menu changes, that's then reflected in the technology that's attached to that account. So it's quite an interesting challenge that we face within the industry in terms of being very, very focused on delivering safe food to our consumers, but also ensuring that. So I think in terms of what I would say to you is I hear some people say to us, oh, well, that stifles the chef creativity and all of those comments. And, my point, from my days in operations would be all chefs have their favorites and what they like to cook, and they perceive they know their customers because their customers experience to what they naturally cook. But what I would say is what we do is we really, really we undertake huge amount of research to understand emerging trends. So when we're building the menu cycles on behalf of the segment, we take all of that information, we take the trends, we take all our health and wellness commitments and everything else, and manage them into the mix so that we change and we provide innovation. And I would say is that the commitment that from me and our development chefs is to provide menus that are on trend. Mm-hmm. And we see in the time that I've been doing this, we're seeing some fairly significant changes in terms of how that overall profile changes with the customers. So it's not necessarily like really sexy and exciting, but I mean, I think in terms of the what we want to do, and I think it will continue, is that it's going to be more around providing a consumer experience. Yep. And I think that's going to be critical to success within the industry. Mm-hmm. I think personalization is going to become more and more important. Mm-hmm. With your consumers, and how do you achieve that? And, my point to you is that consumers now are, I talked about it earlier, 61% of our consumers are making decisions because of health.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's decisions that they want to make about themselves. So our role is to provide them with all of the information that they need so they can make their choices that are right for them. And, to take your point, going right back to the beginning of the conversation is, you could be a Marine, or you could be working on an oil rig in very, very harsh conditions. And, maybe you do need 10,000 calories a day to sustain the energy that you need to do the job that you do.
Yep.
On the other end of the spectrum, you may be in a sedentary role and you need 2,500, 3,000 calories.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of just something as simple as calorific value, in terms of there's a huge, broad requirement that we've got within the industry. And that's why I go back to the point that I made is the menu cycles that are developed within our countries are very, very targeted on each of the segments that they support. So, the ones that we've done for your children in the schools in Philadelphia will be specific for the age range, government legislation, and delivering what we need to do. And that's going to be very, very different could be a senior, or even more different to an adult at work or a patient.
I know it's fascinating. It's not boring. It's I think it all comes back. I didn't mention this first, but I think like on the Sodexo website, it actually, you refer to yourself as a quality of life company. So I mean, all this comes into the quality of life, right? I think it's a beautiful example, and the fact that you have it sort of organized and controlled at this level, I think speaks to the one thing. It speaks to the why the company has been so successful and what it's been doing over the years. So very exciting.
I think you're absolutely right. But I think in terms of as we start to look forward, is that, technology is going to become an integral part of what we do. And, you touched on it is, and at the moment, let's be honest, some of it is relatively niche. It's quite interesting. We've got pilots running where we've got robots making salads, or we've got, we've got robotic carts in a university delivering food to students, and all of this thing is around accessibility. People want convenience, so technology's going to play an important role. The ability for like contactless payments. So you scan your phone when you go in, you go around, you browse the restaurant, you pick up the dishes that you want, etc. And as you go out, you scan your phone again and you get charged. So I think in terms of, tech, for me, technology will continue to play a bigger role in the provision of food service. But I think for me, the counter to that will be that those people that are serving the consumers will be highly focused on delivering a true consumer experience. So you've kind of got, there's this bit over here where it's no really value add. I don't know about you, but for me personally, not having to stand in a line with a tray, pay for my food and get rung up is no hardship for me to scan my phone. Nope. I buy into that. So I think what we will see is that, kind of those roles that are not value add, don't really create an experience. I think we'll see technology overtakes that. And I think that the roles that we will have will be heavily focused on providing that consumer experience. And then the more digitalization that we have, the more data we have, then predictive analytics and just being better, to take your point around product, what do we need, how are we forecasting, that's where we're going to see predictive analytics come in. So we have a much longer, better understanding around menu planning at a site level, and what does that look like in terms of from an order, from a production perspective. You know, and to me, that's just going to be, and I think the other point that I would raise to you that I think it's quite interesting for those of us like me that have been around a long time is remember when you did everything manually. And you know, you've got some people that argue, oh, well, you know, you really had a handle on your business and all the rest of it. But, you know, I can remember in the old days, you know, when you asked to cost out a full menu mix, it was a painful experience and it took forever.
Yeah.
Our managers today have it at the push of a button at the end of service in nanoseconds, which would have been hours and hours of work. But also, as we see new people coming into the industry, yes, challenge around, you know, the you know, talent is there's an expectation of people entering into the food service industry now that that technology and you know AI and digital and everything else is just what they've been brought up with, and not to experience it, you know, within food service is just, you know, it's just something that, you know, we will not attract and retain the talent that we need without having the systems and the technology to enable them to do the job that they're used to doing.
Really fascinating. John, what you're going to be in 2022, you're going to be speaking at the Future Food Tech conference. You've talked a little bit about, well, you've taken us into the future with digitalization and robotics and so forth. What you can talk about what you're going to be talking about, what other things potentially, it's not confidential, but things are getting you excited for 2022 and beyond. And then so that's a part of that. Obviously, food tech on sort of the startup front is kind of hot nowadays. A lot of venture capital putting money into it. What do you look for in terms of partners, in terms of small startups or other innovators that, you know, may have a new protein source or an interesting robot or whatever it may be? How do they partner with Sodexo? What are you looking for in terms of the startup companies?
Yeah, I think for us is that you know, what we look for is something that's been particularly well thought through. Does that make sense?
True.
Doesn't necessarily have to be huge, but in terms of the innovation and the idea has been thought through. For us, it's having a very clear understanding around where that particular piece of technology or that particular product will sit within our overall portfolio. You know, where is it focused? Certainly from our perspective as well, is then understanding, is there an ability to scale up? Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that you know, sometimes that we get challenged with is some really great ideas, some great innovation, but the sheer logistics of the product or the availability of the product means it's incredibly niche and incredibly small. That doesn't mean to say it's not of interest to us. It doesn't necessarily mean to say we wouldn't run a POC or a pilot. We would. But, you know, but with a very clear understanding, it's going to be relatively niche to us. So I think in terms of, for me, some of the things that of interest in terms of as we start to move forward is I'm very interested around plant-based dairy alternatives. And by that, I mean real credible alternatives, because some of the product that's currently available, I almost equate it to the very early days of some of the gluten-free product that we was subjected to. And if you look at it now, some of the gluten-free product is awesome. Yeah. And is no way in any shape or form it's a sacrifice. So I think particularly as it relates to dairy, I think it's not quite as evolved out as it is around sort of animal protein alternatives. I think some of those products are very, very good. I will be also more interested in, and it might be an oxymoron, more protein alternatives that are a little bit more clean label than some of the ones that we see today. And I think also as well is probably in organizations start to think a little bit more about health and wellness. So, you know, some of the sodium contents and stuff like that, some of the product. So I think it's going to be interesting for me in terms of where we get to on a plant-based milk. I think there's a few creamers out there at the moment that really perform well. Some of the cheeses seem to, you know, work better when they're heated versus when they're eaten cold. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be an interest to us. I'm also going to be interested to see, because it's got to come in terms of alternative to seafood in terms of from a plant-based perspective. So at the moment we are committed to go to 100% sustainable seafood. For me, the next step for us would be then, and how much of that seafood can we alternate with, you know, with a plant-based alternative that has, particularly because if you think about it from a seafood perspective, there's a lot of health benefits from seafoods in terms of, you know, being good for the diet. And so therefore any replacements really would have to kind of play into that space. Yeah, so I think in terms of, you know, I'm very interested in particularly the evolution around the whole plant categories, but within different categories. I think that's going to be interesting to us, as well as any real innovation around convenience, because I think that's an area that we see very much, particularly I think it's happened through the pandemic in terms of a lot more people wanting product available to them in a way that's not necessarily a typical vending type alternative. So what could that look like in terms of, and then you are getting to the point, and we've seen some early examples of it in terms of robotics to do shelf fill, so that you know, particularly where you've got, you know, fairly significant evening services where not only do you have to pay significant premium to try and get people to want to work, but also you've got people from a social perspective don't necessarily want to work those hours. So I think it'll be a question in terms of technology in some of those areas will be really interesting to us. And as well as, I think, you know, when we look at the delivery model direct to consumers and using aggregators, it's a very expensive way of getting the product that last mile. And the question will be is, what technology will be brought in to help make that much more accessible to consumers? So I see that there's many things in terms of real interest in terms of, as we start to think about potentially what the future could look like. And but, you know, I think, if, you know, conscious of time, but I think for me, the future is going to be, as I said to you earlier, I think it's going to be much more around personalization for me.
Yep.
I think it's going to be very much around, you know, give me the information that I need to make the right choices for me personally. And I think in terms of that piece around delivering a very great experience,
yep,
going to be, and I don't care whether you're a child at school or whether you're an adult or whatever you are, I think that there is going to be an expectation that you know, that I want an experience. And I think people are becoming less tolerant of mediocrity. Mediocrity, I mean, in terms of service, or mediocrity in terms of the quality of food that they experience. I think that's something that we're that we're all going to be challenged with in terms of, improving in all those areas.
And on that, John, I just have to ask, as you're responsible for serving 100 million consumers a day, do you cook a lot or do you like to go out to eat?
Well, anybody that follows me on Instagram would say I probably do too much of both. I personally, particularly when it comes to the few holidays that I take, I definitely choose locations where I can experience some great food. I very recently went to California, and I ate in a couple of Michelin-starred restaurants. I ate in French Laundry and Single Thread.
Okay.
And so, yeah, but the one thing I would say, I like variety. So being in California, and everyone's go, oh yeah, French Laundry was great, or Single Thread was just absolutely amazing. But I was also recommended a pizza restaurant that had the most amazing pizza and fresh grilled peaches and sweet corn, the best. So for me, it's kind of, I enjoy food. I enjoy to cook. Thanksgiving is on Thursday, so yes, we'll be doing the whole Thanksgiving piece. But I like both, and I think in terms of there's some great food out there, and there's some very, very passionate people. And I don't, not to rattle on, but one of the, I think it was last year, year before, is I went to Mexico and went to Mexico City. And I went to Peugeot, of course, which is the restaurant that everyone says you better go to. But I have to say, I did a food tour of taco stands on the corners of streets and in markets, and I had some of the best food ever.
Yeah.
So, fine.
You never know. I had some excellent sushi in Mexico City, actually, a few years ago.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought, Well, this has been delightful, John. I mean, it's been fascinating hearing about your journey and everything that you're going to be doing moving forward with the company. It's very exciting times. And for everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode on our podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to John Wright, Senior Vice President, Global Head of Food at Sodexo, innovating at the fascinating forefront of quality life services and experiences. John, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while today. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing there on the innovation front. As we say on this show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through everything you're doing. Really fascinating story.
Thank you for the opportunity, and it was great to meet you.